Good evening. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here to the William G. McGowan Theater. On this date, 50 years ago, American Ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, showed photographic evidence of the missile buildup in Cuba to an emergency session of the Security Council. For another week, the world held its breath, wondering if nuclear annihilation was on the horizon. During the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, President John Kennedy and his advisors sorted through intelligence reports and debated on what action to take. Our new exhibit upstairs in the O'Brien Gallery chronicles the events of the crisis through original documents from the National Archives and the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library. As you go through the exhibit, you can imagine yourself present at the past, especially as you listen in on recordings of meetings and discussions held in the White House throughout the crisis. A secret tape recording system recorded these meetings in the Oval Office and the Cabinet Room, leaving us with an amazing first-person account of this pivotal moment in history. Tonight, our panel will discuss those secret White House tapes from the Cuban Missile Crisis as we play some excerpts. Our moderator, Tim Naftali, is former director of the University of Virginia's Miller Center Presidential Recordings Project and was also director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library until 2011. Our panelists are David G. Coleman, the author of The 14th Day, and Ted Widmer, co-author of Listening In, the Secret White House Tapes of John F. Kennedy. We're also delighted to welcome Caroline Kennedy to tonight's program. Caroline has had a long association with the National Archives and its presidential libraries, and is the author and editor of 9 best-selling books on American history, politics, and poetry, active in efforts to improve New York City's public schools, and she also serves as president of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Caroline Kennedy.
Good evening. Thank you. Thank you, David. It's always a humbling and inspiring experience to be back at the National Archives. And my family and the Kennedy Library are honored to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis here in this building with this distinguished panel and this new exhibit, which I hope you'll all visit. I want to thank David Ferriero for all he's done to strengthen and build a relationship between the National Archives and the presidential libraries, which are part of its system, and for his love of documents and history and the inspiring outreach that he's been doing here. And I'm proud also that one of the documents that's on display as the last item in the exhibit is the American official copy of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which my father considered his most important accomplishment. It means a great deal to all of us that 50 years after my father's presidency, so many people still share his ideals and vision for America. To me, his greatest legacy is the people that he inspired. Almost every day, someone comes up to me and says, "Your father changed my life. I got involved in my community, or the Peace Corps, or they volunteered in the inner city, or went to outer space because he asked us all to give something back to this country that's given us all so much." And that generation passed their commitment on to their children and grandchildren, and that continuity of spirit continues to work for a more just and peaceful world. As we approach the 50th anniversary, my family and the staff at the Kennedy Library thought a great deal about how to best celebrate and honor his accomplishments. We recognize that his time is becoming part of history rather than living memory, and that brings opportunities as well as challenges. Both my parents loved history. My father read voraciously about the Civil War, and I still have all his books. My mother read about the ancient world and the 18th century. My father read about parliamentary history. For them, the past was not a dry or dull affair, but really full of exciting people, inspiring heroes, and events that could teach us about our own time. So we all decided to concentrate on making the history of my father's administration accessible to the widest possible audience in the hope that the treasures of the Kennedy Library will inspire generations growing up today, just as the past inspired my parents. So on the 50th anniversary of the inauguration in January 2011, here at the National Archives, we launched the Digital Archive, where we put all of President Kennedy's correspondence, films, memos, speeches, drafts online, so that anyone around the world could have access to this material. You can search this archive, and it's not just researchers or scholars who can make their way to Boston now. We created the President's Desk. It's an interactive exhibit, and we translated 40 of his most memorable speeches into 40 languages. So it was really an effort to recognize that we're living in a globalized world, and that he really was, in a way, the first sort of international president in the television age, modern age. Last fall, we released my mother's oral history, which was 7 conversations that she had with Arthur Schlesinger, which had been sealed at the Kennedy Library since 1964. And now, to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have released a book that you'll hear about tonight, and a CD set called Listening In, the secret White House tapes of John F. Kennedy. And Ted Widmer, who's going to be on the panel tonight, served as the editor and wrote the very illuminating introductions, because the idea is that, that we wanted to make this accessible, we wanted to make it intriguing and engaging so that people will get a sense from what they hear or see in this book, and hopefully go on to study more and want to learn more about our own time as well as that time. President Kennedy taped 265 hours of meetings, phone conversations, and private dictation between 1962, when the taping system was installed in July of that year, and 1963. So as you'll learn from the panelists, much of this material has already been available and released, but it hasn't been accessible in an easy way. Some of the recordings are hard to understand, the technology is old, and it isn't always clear who's speaking in the meetings. So we tried to select highlights that were really significant and give you a sense of the complexity and the range of issues, as well as the most important kind of topics of his presidency. So presidential taping, secret presidential taping, has a controversial reputation. So I hope we'll hear our panelists talk about that. But I think that it's really unquestionable that having this record of the Cuban Missile Crisis is a unique historical resource that is tremendously important and beneficial. There's really nothing else like it. Presidential decision-making in real time at one of the most dangerous moments in our history. So the tapes teach so many valuable lessons for historians, for policymakers, and for generations to come by preserving this history and this record. And I hope that people will take the time to visit the exhibit here and listen to the tapes, which puts them in context with many of the most important documents, so you really get a better understanding. I want to thank the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, whose scholars have done so much over these decades to help analyze and transcribe these tapes. And as Bob Schieffer noted on Monday night during the foreign policy debate, it was exactly 50 years since the missiles were discovered in Cuba this week. So watching the candidates right now discuss the dangers and challenges we face brings home the unpredictability of world events and the importance of learning from the past. This crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, will never be repeated, but I think the importance of diplomacy, of trust, of exploring a range of options, listening to contrary opinions, are lessons that stand the test of time. For me, the most important realization, and one that's front and center as we approach Election Day, is how critical it is that we elect men, and hopefully women, who have the judgment and character to make the wisest choice and keep this country safe. As a citizen at an election season, I found it fascinating to listen to my father talk about what kind of person succeeds in politics, what kind of temperament you need. He believed that the times were right, the times were changing, and that he was right for his time. And so you can apply his standard and comments to today's race. I know how I come down, but you can make up your own mind. And as his child, I cherish the parts where my brother and I appear on the tapes. I remember walking him to the office in the morning before school and visiting him in the afternoon to play under his desk. It was the highlight of the day for John and for me, and I think the delight in his voice shows that he felt the same way. And I feel fortunate to be able to listen in on his meetings, to hear his tone of voice, his chuckle, his irritation, but most of all, his conviction that politics is a way of solving problems, and the belief that each person should give something, part of their life, to serving our country. So I hope that listeners will be inspired by his example and the sense of purpose that comes through these tapes and answer that call. So I'm happy to be here tonight with all of you, and I'd like to thank you for coming on behalf of the Kennedy Library, and now I'd like to ask our panelists to come to the stage. Thank you.
You're in for a treat. There have been a lot of 50th anniversary Cuban Missile Crisis commemorative events. Some of you may have seen the PBS show. We've got a commemorative event with a difference. Because in a sense, you're going to be listening to the people who really mattered, those who made the key decisions on the American side in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some of you might not know how tense the period was. We are very fortunate to have on stage two people who are going to be able to introduce and comment on the materials you see. David Coleman runs a presidential recordings program, the Miller Center Public Affairs. You can read more about him in your program. He oversees the transcription and annotation of all of John F. Kennedy's tapes through January 1963, and a number of the volumes have already appeared. Caroline Kennedy Schlossberg talked about Ted's book, Ted Whitmer's book. Ted is a very accomplished historian, and I made him laugh, although I don't know why, because I told him that his book on Martin Van Buren is also very good, although it's not relevant to tonight's event. To get you into a sense of the tension of that period, David has put together a little film, and this film doesn't just cover the 13 days, because our discussion today is about more than just those 13 days in October, because President Kennedy faced a series of challenges even when the most pitched moment of the crisis had ended. Those moments, those decisions are almost as important as the famous ones of the 13 days. And to give you a sense, to set the scene, we've got this film for you right now.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The United States' answer to what Adlai Stevenson termed Soviet blackmail in Cuba was a quarantine of all offensive weapons being shipped from Russia to that island fortress. The U.S. threw up a steel fence, prepared to stop any vessel carrying materials of war. In Cuba itself, 100,000 men were put under emergency orders, as they had been during past invasion scares. The waterfront in Havana and along other parts of the coast bristled with gun emplacements as the Cuban regime waited to see what their bosses in the Kremlin were to do. Cuba became the focus of world attention. Here centered the most critical threat of global war since the surrender of Germany 17 years ago. To suggestions that a UN team inspect missile sites, Castro said that they had better come ready for combat. He went on to call President Kennedy a pirate for setting up the quarantine. The United States arrived at the decision for an arms blockade after studying reconnaissance photographs made with high-powered cameras from planes flying several miles from the Cuban coast. These cameras are described as capable of spotting a golf ball on a putting green from 40,000 feet. Literally thousands of pictures can be made on each flight by these planes, and they are studied by photo interpreters who are capable of analyzing details that an untrained eye would miss. Here, for example, is a medium-range ballistic missile base that has been labeled by these specialists. Suddenly, the veil is torn from the Russian secrets. Another photo revealed a surface-to-air missile assembly depot, a base to supply the offensive sites. Russian technicians ripped through heavy jungle growth to carve out airstrips for high-performance MiG-21 jets, a plane easily capable of strikes far into the United States. The United States went to the UN Security Council for a resolution calling for a withdrawal of all offensive weapons from Cuba. The curtain goes up at the United Nations on what the world hopes is the final act in the drama that was the Cuban crisis. The Soviet Union is represented by Khrushchev's special envoy, Russia's first deputy foreign minister, Vasily Kuznetsov. He is here to confer with Fourteenth before the acting secretary general left for Cuba to arrange the dismantling of Soviet missile bases. Fourteenth met separately with both Russian and United States representatives to iron out some preliminary details before his conferences with Castro. It is planned that observers from nations not allied with either side will supervise the removal of the sites. Then it is hoped the final curtain will fall. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara presides at an unprecedented news conference to refute charges that the administration is holding back on the strength of Russian men and arms in Cuba. The charges were made by members of Congress, and Mr. McNamara is emphatic in denying that there has been an appreciable buildup. He turns the briefing over to John Hughes, a Pentagon intelligence aide, who reveals for the first time that Russia had nuclear weapons in Cuba until the October retreat to Moscow. He went on to add that Soviet military personnel in Cuba reached a peak of 22,000 by November 1st, but this has been reduced to about 17,000. Senator Kenneth Keating of New York, who has charged repeatedly that the administration has underestimated Soviet strength in Cuba, is not satisfied with the exposition.
I stand on my statement that there's 10 times as much military equipment there now, and in addition to this, the Soviet troops are digging in. These combat troops are building semi-permanent or permanent barracks, and this is a part of my statement that they're at least 10 times stronger.
The next day, at the President's news conference, little attention is paid to any matter but the Cuban question.
This issue involves a very definitely war and peace, and when you talk about the presence of offensive weapons there, if they are there, I think the Soviet Union is aware, and Cuba is aware, that we would be back where we were in October, but in a far more concentrated way. And after our experience last fall, we operate on the assumption, while hoping for the best, we expect the worst. It's very possible that the worst will come, and we should prepare for it. That's why we continue our daily surveillance. It's possible, conceivable. We cannot prove that there is not a missile in a cave, or the Soviet Union isn't going to ship next week. We prepare for that. But we will find them when they do, and when they do, the Soviet Union and Cuba and the United States must all be aware that this will produce the greatest crisis which the world has faced in its history.
In 1996 and 1998, the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum opened the first set of Cuban Missile Crisis tapes. They would change the narrative of the story. And one of the things they taught us is the extent to which there was tension between the military and our civilian leadership. David, tell us about the first clip, please.
Thank you, Tim. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. None of us on this stage could do our work without the National Archives, whether it's the holdings here in downtown, in College Park, or the Presidential Libraries. And I particularly also want to thank, on behalf of my program, one of the lesser-known National Archives entities called the National Historic Publications and Records Commission, which makes our work possible. As Tim said, Ms. Kennedy said at the beginning, President Kennedy liked during this period to entertain contrasting ideas. He was quite comfortable doing that, and it's actually one of the things that made his governance even better. And one of the people who wasn't afraid to give him contrasting views was a gentleman by the name of General Curtis LeMay, head of Strategic Air Command. This is the same person who was later quoted talking about bombing Vietnam back to the Stone Age. During the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 19th, 1962, Kennedy had the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Oval Office to get their advice on what they should do. There are a few different options on the table. One of them is we send in airstrikes, take out the missile sites. The second thing that they could have done was a full invasion. The third was a blockade. Now, there's two things that will come up in this particular conversation that you should know about. One of them is Munich, appeasement. To this particular generation in the early 1960s, this was a very potent word. For President Kennedy, it was especially potent because of his father's role in the appeasement period while he was ambassador to London. And you'll hear LeMay needle that. The second thing you'll hear about is them referring to Berlin. Now, you might wonder, if this is the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we've got missiles 90 miles off the coast of Cuba, why are they talking about a place halfway around the world? The answer is, one of the things that comes up in the tapes over and over again, and one of the things, it sort of comes through in the documents but not as clearly, is that President Kennedy, through this crisis, was constantly trying to work out why Khrushchev might have done this. What is it that Khrushchev's up to? Because if you work out what he's up to, then it's much easier to respond better, in a much more effective way. President Kennedy kept coming back to West Berlin. The Americans, along with Western allies, had committed to the protection of this city. Khrushchev in 1958, and this dates back, of course, to the Berlin blockade in 1948, but Khrushchev in 1958 had kind of started the ball rolling by threatening West Berlin and trying to force the West out of there. Kennedy, through the summer of 1962, is fully expecting, with good reason, mind you, because Khrushchev is basically telling the West and everyone who will listen to this, that Khrushchev is going to force the issue once the November 1962 elections are over. He's going to finally force it. And so during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy keeps coming back to Berlin. But not everyone agrees, as you'll hear here.
Well, as for the Berlin situation, I don't share your view that if we knock off Cuba, they're going to knock off Berlin. We've got the Berlin problem staring us face anyway. If we don't do anything to Cuba, then they're going to push on Berlin, and push real hard, because they got us on the run. If we take military action against Cuba, then I think that...
What do you think their reprisal would be?
I don't think they're going to make any reprisal. If we tell them that the Berlin situation is just like it's always been, if they make a move, we're going to fight. I don't think it changes the Berlin situation at all, except we've got to make one more statement on it. So I see no other solution. This blockade and political action I see leading into war. I don't see any other solution to it. It'll lead right into war. This is almost as bad as the appeasement of Munich. Because if the blockade comes along, our MiGs are going to fly, the IL-28s are going to fly against it, and we're just going to gradually drift into a war under conditions that are a great disadvantage to us, with missiles staring us in the face of that can knock out our airfields in the southeastern portion, and if they use nuclear weapons, there's the population down there. So we just drift into a war under conditions that we don't like. But I just don't see any other solution except direct military intervention right now.
That's tough talking to a president, isn't it?
It sure is. He wasn't afraid to say to speak his mind.
Ted, would you, somebody who's thought broadly about presidencies, would you say it's unusual in our history to have that kind of pushback from the military?
Extremely, and he'd had an uncomfortable time with LeMay throughout his presidency, and there were already the conditions of pretty deep distrust stemming from the Bay of Pigs incident in April 1961. And it's a complicated question because as president, one wants advisors with the courage to talk back. And in other places in this book, we see that and we admire the kinds of open-ended conversations that were happening, very spirited conversations. There's an argument, basically, between President Kennedy and James Webb, the top NASA administrator, about the practicability of sending a rocket to the moon with men on it. And they really get into it. And you come away from that conversation thinking, I'm glad that people had the courage to speak to President Kennedy that honestly, and I'm glad that President Kennedy liked to have people around like that. But this is a different situation. This is a tense argument, and LeMay is essentially wrong. But it's difficult to argue military matters with someone like Curtis LeMay. He'd been a very successful Air Force general in World War II. He had a strong track record, and President Kennedy was a lower-ranking officer in World War II. They had a generational gap between them. So this was not an easily resolved situation, and you're very right that that word appeasement, that single word, was highly charged. And not only had John F. Kennedy lived that time as the son of Joseph P. Kennedy, but he studied it about as closely as it was possible to be studied. His first book was Why England Slept, which was a study of exactly that problem. So he knew it very well. And the pause to me is nearly as telling as the remark. There's just a very long pause. And you wonder what's going through his head. And you sort of wait for the angry response. It doesn't come right there.
Well, President Kennedy was very cool.
Very.
But do you think he might have been tapping his finger on something?
Well, there are a few moments in these tapes where you hear the sounds of impatience, and a tapping finger is one. And I think he was just playing it very, very cool. You're exactly right. And he probably was already beginning to figure out how he was going to make General LeMay irrelevant by outthinking him and outmaneuvering him. And there's another fascinating moment in the tapes, you both know well, where the system was left running when President Kennedy had left the room. And General LeMay's mouth kept running also. And he says some pretty surprising things, come up to the line of insubordination, doesn't quite cross it, I don't think. He was speaking privately, but strongly critical of the president's leadership. And the other Joint Chiefs in the room were also. And it's fascinating to hear that bit of recording on a tape recorder that was running when the president wasn't even in the room. We don't know that he ever heard it. He probably did not. His secretary believed that he never even listened to the tapes. But nevertheless, those words were captured. He would have heard them eventually. Yeah. It's pretty interesting.
His brother Bobby heard them,
right.
No doubt. One of the things that you might want to keep in mind is that these military leaders were all heroes of World War II. They were therefore heroes in a conventional war, and they now had nuclear toys. And they were treating war as if it were the same as it had been in World War II. And John Kennedy he said to a number of people, President Kennedy said to a number of people, I'm a nuclear-age president. The rules have changed. We can't approach war the same way. David, speaking of war, we have a clip that's you described as strange, Dr. Strangelovian.
Yes, to coin an adjective. This is one of my favorite clips in a twisted kind of way. We saw at the beginning in the video tape the public side of the Cuban Missile Crisis, what was being portrayed in the news. Everyone knew it was tense, it was close, but it's comforting to think that the people in the room who need to know what's going on and need to have control, know what's going on and have control. One of the things the tapes bring out is not just sort of these moments like General LeMay challenging the president, but they bring out some fairly uncomfortable moments. And this one is actually about 7 hours before President Kennedy goes on television for his speech, the one that started in the video, where he goes on and announces the blockade and announces that they found the missiles in Cuba. And so Kennedy and his advisors are trying to get all their ducks in a row. They're trying to make sure that the moment he goes on television, he doesn't start a war. What he really doesn't want to happen is for that war to be started by Americans. This particular clip is from a meeting about midday on October 22nd, where he brings in his Berlin advisors. So if there's going to be a nuclear war anywhere for about a decade and a half before, it's probably going to start over Berlin. So this is a hot spot already. So he already has senior advisors on the problem. But he brings them in because what he wants to make sure is that when he goes on television, when the Soviets respond, that Americans don't start shooting missiles because they lose communication or something like that. And he's particularly worried about the ones in Europe that are under American control. And the other thing that will come up here is a lot of acronyms, or at least acronyms. When President Kennedy became president, he learned about what they call the SIOP, S-I-O-P, the Single Integrated Operational Plan. Now, this is the war plan. If nuclear war starts, this is what happens. Now, President Kennedy and just about every president since him was appalled to find out that he actually had very little control once things started. Because what happens is it's almost an automated process. Once war starts, you start sending thousands of missiles off, hitting the same target many times over, who knows why. But it's an automated process. And for a president who's with the hand on the trigger, that is not very comfortable. So you'll hear here essentially that same kind of thing, automated nuclear war coming out again. And again, a little bit of tension with the culture of the Joint Chiefs.
You raised that with defense. McNamara and I wrote out a suggested instruction from him to the chiefs, and we took it up with the chiefs. The chiefs came back with a paper saying that those instructions are already out.
Well, why don't we reinforce them? Because as I say, we may be attacking the Cuban, and the reprisal may come on these, and we don't want them firing without our notifying them.
The ones in Turkey are not operational.
Yes, they are.
Oh, they are.
15 of them are on alert right now.
Could we take care of that then, Paul? We need a new instruction out.
I'll go back and tell them.
Do they object to sending a new one out?
They object to sending it out because it to their view, compromises their standing instruction. You reinforce one standing instruction.
But let's have a look at the existing order and see how definite it is. And let's simply say the President directs your attention again to umpteen.
They can send a personal message to the commander saying,
I want to be sure you fully understand paragraph so-and-so of your orders.
Surely be done one way or the other.
they did come back with another point, and that was NATO's strategic concept requires the immediate execution of EDP in such event.
What's EDP?
European Defense Plan, which is nuclear war.
Well, that means in
Well,
order.
that's why we want to get on that, you see. Now,
So they said the orders are that nothing can go without the presidential order.
But you see, what they don't know in Greece and Turkey and Italy, what we know, and therefore they don't realize there is a chance there will be a spot reprisal. And what we got to do is make sure these fellows do know, so that they don't fire them off and think the United States is under attack. I don't think we ought to accept the chief's word on that one, Paul. I understand why they did that. These fellows, they think everybody knows as much as we know, and they don't.
They might have had the nuclear war is already on.
Well, I'm sure that these fellows are thoroughly indoctrinated not to fire any. This is what McNamara and I went over to look into, and they really are
Well, let's do it
indoctrinated on
again.
that point. But I've got your point. We'll do it again.
So just to clarify, and I know the names are a little vague there, but the person who didn't know that the Turkish missiles were operational was the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk.
Well, I mentioned something about World War II leaders. Of course, there was a very famous World War II leader who was around when John F. Kennedy was president, and that was former President Dwight Eisenhower. Ted is going to introduce a phenomenal conversation between President Kennedy and former President Eisenhower that gives you perhaps a sense of the two different cultures at work during this crisis. Ted?
I'll do that in a second, but I wanted to echo what David said about the value of the archives to historians. We really are in partnership, and we couldn't do any of this work without them. And I also want to give a shout out to two other institutions. The John F. Kennedy Library takes extraordinarily good care of these recordings, and the librarians and archivists there were just a constant help to me in this project, but also the Miller Center, which both of you, where you are affiliated and where you were affiliated, has been doing work of the highest quality for a long time on the recordings of President Kennedy and all presidents who did tape recordings, and we really owe them, all of us in the country owe them a debt of gratitude. So I just wanted to say that.
Thanks.
This conversation is fascinating. Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy did not always get along as easily as they do in this conversation. President Kennedy, then Senator Kennedy in 1960, had run largely on attacking the Eisenhower administration for being complacent. And that irritated President Eisenhower, who seemed genial. He had a very good public image, but was extremely thin-skinned. And yet they had come a long distance, and in their early meetings between the election and the inauguration in January 1961, they had meetings of great substance, and I think they each came away very impressed by the force and the intellect of the other man. And Eisenhower was a natural ally to turn to in the dark days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and October 22nd is a dark day. It's in the hours leading up to the speech that will pull the cover off of this crisis and reveal how serious it is to the world. And President Kennedy's asking a basic question to President Eisenhower: what would you do? Do you think the Russians are going to fire their nuclear weapons at us if we invade? And Eisenhower gives his honest answer: no, I don't think so. And they even get to some laughter at the end of the conversation. Amazingly, Eisenhower advises President Kennedy to have his people on alert, and you can believe that everyone was already on high alert. That wasn't a problem. But then President Kennedy laughs and says, okay, hang on tight. And it's a nice moment in the middle of a very serious crisis where two seasoned leaders are talking easily with each other and helping each other out. I think Eisenhower was gratified to be consulted. I think President Kennedy was gratified to be able to call him. Eisenhower had the gravitas of a very high-ranking warrior, World War II, but he also had criticized the military-industrial complex in his farewell message. So he was someone whose independent judgment I think President Kennedy really admired. And why don't we listen to the tape?
Well, I thank you for telling me, and I will, personally, I think they're really making the only move you can.
Yeah, it's tough to, as I say, we will, I don't know, we may get into the invasion business before many days are out,
yeah.
but
of course, the military standpoint, that's a clean-cut thing to do now.
That's right.
Because
that's right.
you've made up your mind, you've got to get rid of this thing.
Right.
Well,
right.
the only real way to get rid of it, of course, is the other thing. But if having to be concerned with world opinion
And Berlin.
Others, why you got to do a little slower.
Well, Berlin is the, I suppose that it may be what they're going to try to trade off.
They might, but I personally, I just don't quite go along, with that thinking, Mr. President. My idea is this: the damn Soviets will do whatever they want, what they figure is good for them.
Yeah.
And I don't believe they relate one situation with another. That's
right.
what they find out they can do here and there and the other place.
Yeah, yeah.
And we're already standing at the unit with NATO that if they go into Berlin, that's all of it.
Right.
That means they've got to look out that they don't get a terrific blow themselves.
Right, right.
And I don't, it might be, I could be all wrong, but my own conviction is that you will not find a great deal of relationship between the two.
Let me ask.
They'll try to make it that way.
General, what about if the Soviet Union, Khrushchev announces tomorrow, which I think he will, that if we attack Cuba, that it's going to be nuclear war? And what's your judgment as to the chances they'll fire these things off if we invade Cuba?
Oh, I don't believe it.
You don't think they will? In other words, you would take that risk if the situation seemed desirable.
As a matter of fact, what can you do? If this thing is such a serious thing here on our flank, that we're going to be uneasy, and we know what's things happening now. All right, you've got to use something.
Right.
Something may make these people shoot them off. I just don't believe this will.
Yeah, all right. Well,
In any event, of course, I'll say this. I'd want to keep my own people very alert.
yeah. No, hang on tight.
Yes, sir.
Thanks a lot, General.
All right, thanks.
All right.
David, did you want to add anything to that conversation?
Actually, one of the things that's always struck me about that is how carefully President Kennedy gets Eisenhower to say, yes, this is what I would do as well. Because the last thing he wanted, and this is only a few hours before he's giving his speech, the last thing he wants is for him to give his speech and for a senior Republican leader to come out and say, and especially someone with Eisenhower's military background, to say you're doing the wrong thing. So he's very careful in there to get Eisenhower on the record.
It's worth adding a point, Tim and David, that I think Eisenhower, even though giving comforting advice, which was extremely helpful in the resolution of the crisis, was probably wrong. And that's because neither man knew what we now know, that there was a much larger number of smaller nuclear weapons in Cuba. And as history unfolds over time, we have better access to these recordings. We also picked up a lot of information from the Soviet archives in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse. And there was a very large number of tactical nuclear weapons that were ready with battlefield commanders for use if the US had invaded. So there were scenarios in which use of nuclear weapons by the Russians were much more likely than I think Eisenhower knew at the time.
We had to make choices about what we would play tonight. And so we're going to be, our next clips are from after the crisis. But before we do that, I wanted to ask the two panelists about what the tapes from the second week of the crisis teach us about John F. Kennedy's leadership.
Well, this entire crisis, which is captured so well in the tapes rolled for nearly all of it, it could be a lesson in leadership for a business school or a political school. And I think it includes some counterintuitive lessons. Most leadership schools say, make a crisp, fast decision and stand by it. And in fact, many of the decisions were arrived at quite slowly in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the team, ExComm and President Kennedy, had the vital luxury of about 5 or 6 days to think through the issues carefully without the crush of public attention, without the Russians knowing, without the media knowing. And in those 5 or 6 days, the mood of the room changed a lot, and I would argue for the better. Certain people changed their minds. Robert Kennedy was taking a much harder line in the first day than he ultimately took. And information came in a fast-moving situation, and the slowness of the decision, I think, led to a much better decision for the quarantine rather than the invasion. I think also President Kennedy showed throughout an ability to pull back from what was right in front of him. He pulled back globally. He was always thinking, as we heard on the earlier tape, about Berlin. Berlin is closely connected in his mind to Cuba. And the opinion of the world was always a matter of great importance. The OAS voted unanimously to endorse the United States position. African countries, that one of which at least was inclined to support Marxism, refused permission to Russian bombers to refuel. And so he was thinking about the entire global picture, not just Cuba. He was also thinking about the problem in terms of history. He was enlarging the problem that way. He had read that year Barbara Tuchman's great book, The Guns of August, about the almost helpless way the nations of Europe just sort of tumbled into World War I without anyone really wanting to go to war. And he had sent that book out to advisors and to military installations, and he said, I don't want a book to be written called The Missiles of October, after the Guns of August. So he, in all of these ways, he was taking some of the heat off. He was buying time. He was expanding the decision. I think he also had a crucial ability to think like his adversary. He pulled back in that sense. He was always trying to think, what is Nikita Khrushchev thinking right now? How can I help him make the right decision? How can I give him better options than the immediate option of attacking us? And some of that work was extremely important. And a final decision not to gloat once it had become clear that his approach had prevailed and we had achieved peace. I should say we, with the Russians, achieved peace together. He directed his closest advisors not to gloat. And I think all of those decisions were part of a very successful procedure that might fly in the face of a business school class, but it got us to the right place. We're here and we're alive.
David, you want to say something about the second week?
I think that one of the things that comes through strikingly, and it comes through even more strongly on the tapes, but we kind of knew this already. He had made a decision, he took a stand, but then is still willing to think creatively how to get out of this. And I think the most obvious example, of course, of this is the back channel communications with Bobby Kennedy and talk of the Jupiters. I think that's something that comes through in these second week recordings very much, is that he wasn't sort of necessarily boxed in, and he was quite willing to think creatively how to get out of this situation. And I think that actually came from confidence and strength as opposed to weakness.
I would add that the Cuban Missile Crisis is sometimes described as unusual in President Kennedy's administration, in the sense that the decision-making is at a higher level than it had ever been before, and to some extent later. I don't believe it. It's not true, in fact. It's just we have the tapes, and so we know this better than we know the decision-making beforehand. But President Kennedy's approach to problem-solving was always the same. It was always involved the ability to see dilemmas. Think about that. That's very hard for a political leader, to understand dilemmas. It's both a strength and a weakness, because it means a lot of decisions are 51-49, just like the election. Sorry. I don't work for the National Archives anymore, I can see that. So the Cuban Missile Crisis shows the president's ability to probe issues and to understand dilemmas. And would you say it's fair, both of you, that he did it better than anybody else in the room? Would you say that in...
I would, yes. I think this is a triumph of, and in the tensest circumstances possible, with a very narrow window of success at the beginning. The window kept getting bigger day after day. Just as David said, he kept probing for creative ways around the problem, and tiny fine-tuning along with larger tuning. In the speech of October 22nd, he saw the word miscalculate, very ordinary word, and he remembered that Khrushchev had erupted at the use of the word miscalculate during their Vienna summit in 1961. So it was just a single word that irritated Khrushchev, and he took it out, changed it. So this was a really successful process, and I think we almost should feel lucky that the disaster of the Bay of Pigs had happened to give him that skepticism of bad advice that led him to find these better outcomes.
You're going to have the opportunity to buy books afterwards. I'm going to be crass and commercial. One of those books is called On the 14th Day, and it's by David Coleman. And it's about the aftermath. And I'd like David to explain, because you're about to hear a few clips that show that President Kennedy's troubles did not end completely on October 28th when the 13th day ended. David.
Thank you. Just by way of illustration, I'm going to throw some numbers at you. 42 MRBMs. That's how many were still in Cuba on the 13th day, the 14th day, the day after Khrushchev had capitulated via radio. Now, on the 13th day, October 28th, 1962, Khrushchev had sent a radio message that essentially said, okay, we'll take out the weapons that you call offensive. That effectively ended the crisis as far as most studies take it. But if you think about it, the situation on the ground is still potent. On the 14th day, there are still 42 MRBMs in Cuba, some of which are operational. There are about 42,000 Soviet troops. The Americans had recently discovered that some of those were actually combat regiments. There were 42 IL-28 bombers, and you'll hear this IL-28 thing a few times now, and we heard it in one of the earlier clips. This is a type of long-range nuclear bomber that the Soviets had sent to Cuba. They were old, they were obsolete, but they could carry nuclear bombs, and the Soviets had actually sent nuclear bombs with them. These could strike much of the southeast United States. They were still in Cuba. There were nuclear submarines. There were torpedo boats. There were tactical nuclear weapons that Ted mentioned earlier. So this, on the 14th day, is a very potent situation still. The last number I'll give you is you had one promise. Khrushchev had said, we'll remove the missiles. And that's really the heart of what happens for the next few weeks, is they're trying to work out, will Khrushchev follow through on this? And also, what exactly did he mean? Now, Kennedy had good reason not to trust Khrushchev's promise. On October 18th, during the height of the crisis, he had had the Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko in the Oval Office and had asked him flat out, are you installing Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba? And Gromyko had said no. Absolutely not. I've been instructed to say no, we're not going to do it. Kennedy referred to this in his October 22nd speech. This was kind of his one example of Soviet duplicity. And so it wasn't just a question of whether he could believe the Soviets, but the American people were not going to believe the Soviets when Khrushchev had said he promised them. And so what you end up with in the next few weeks are some very difficult decisions on how to make sure that Khrushchev is following through on this. All right. Haven't got the one lined up, but basically, the XCOM, Kennedy was rolling the tapes through the 13 days, but he kept rolling the tapes afterwards. And so what we get is this incredible record of a series of decisions on a day-by-day basis, trying to decide whether or not to send Americans in a harm's way. Now, for the rest of the world, the crisis is essentially over, but Kennedy is still facing on a daily basis. Do I send American pilots over Cuba to try and verify that Khrushchev's not lying to us? Now, as you may well know, of course, an American U-2 plane had been shot down on October 27th already. We knew that the Soviets could attack the planes and take them down if they wanted to. The Americans were also sending in low-level planes, which took much better photographs, but they were much more vulnerable. And so what you get on the tapes is Kennedy deciding, do I send American pilots today into harm's way, potentially to have one shot down? And then it's not just a question, okay, we don't want to lose a pilot, that's never good, but what do we do then if they do shoot down a plane? Do we have to strike back? Do we have to launch a military invasion, or just do we get airstrikes? Because we can't just take this. And there's actually a very interesting conversation that doesn't turn up anywhere in any other documentary source that I know about. The tape is essentially just rolling in the Oval Office. There's Kennedy and George Bundy, his national security advisor, there. Bobby Kennedy is meeting with the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin, at that moment. President Kennedy has just received word from the Pentagon that an American surveillance plane has been shot down. And so President Kennedy calls his brother while his brother is meeting with the Soviet ambassador, and they're trying to think through, okay, we need to find out what this information is. We need to think about how we're going to respond. Now, one of the things that Kennedy thinks that might have sparked all of this in the first place is that the Americans had decided to push on another type of weapon that was in Cuba. It was never just about missiles, and this was the IL-28s. President Kennedy had decided that he didn't want to get the deal hung up on these. But other people in the room were arguing very forcefully as to why it was necessary to get these out. And these were never in what Khrushchev considered the weapons you call offensive. And so the Americans had to make an issue of this and prepared for military action if it came to it. And there are many discussions about this on the tapes. Again, this is all happening behind the scenes. So one of the people who comes out most forcefully in favor of pushing this issue is the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara.
I think it's absolutely essential that the IL-28s are part of the deal. I don't think we could live with the American public if they weren't. These are bombers with substantial capability, 750-mile range, 4,000-pound bomb load. We've just got to get those out of there. And we need to know whether there's any evidence that the Soviets are planning to get them out. And if they are planning to get them out, there should be at least an engine removed from a nacelle, or a tail assembly taken off, or a wing dismounted from a fuselage between Monday and Thursday.
So eventually, they pushed very hard on this issue. And on November 20th, President Kennedy has a press conference over in the State Department auditorium and announces, we have a deal. The Soviets have finally agreed to remove these bombers from Cuba. In return, we are finally lifting the naval quarantine of Cuba. And that is kind of the November 20 deal. But there are other things going on there that Kennedy was still having to decide on. One of those, I'm going to raise, Ted actually mentioned them a little bit, was the tactical nuclear weapons. Oh, actually, it was 50 years ago today, October 25th. The Americans had sent over a low-level surveillance plane, took much more detailed photos, and this plane found combat brigades in in Cuba. And these combat brigades were armed with nuclear-capable rockets. This was reported to the XCOM the next day. So President Kennedy, the Joint Chiefs, and everyone knew that there were nuclear-capable rockets in Cuba from the 26th of October. The Joint Chiefs, after that, are still recommending invasion. Massive airstrikes and then invasion, knowing that it could be a nuclear battlefield they're sending the troops into. And as a very interesting exchange that we get on the tapes, on the 14th day, President Kennedy has the Marine Corps Commandant, General David Shoup, and the Chief of Naval Operations in the Oval Office. And they're talking about what an invasion of Cuba would look like. And one of the things they raise is this idea of what happens if they use tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba.
Not but my guess is that everybody sort of figures that being extremist is everybody uses nuclear weapons. The decision to use any kind of a nuclear weapon, even the tactical ones, presents such a risk of getting out of control so quickly that there's a risk. But Cuba is so small compared to the world. If that joker ever had the control, of course they're telling them they got the keys, like I'm sure they do. The Russians say we got the keys, you got the keys, you trust us, we trust you. No, we don't trust each other, but we figure that they're never giving to the Cubans any more than we'd give them to the Turks. Because we know that I don't think anybody wants that weapon to escape from their control. It's just too.
What President Kennedy didn't know at that point was that the Soviets intended to hand the tactical weapons over to the Cubans. That was part of the Soviet plan. Now, the Soviets were going to retain control over the warheads, but the U.S. government didn't really understand what the Soviets intended to do with these nuclear weapons. And keep this in mind because, as Ted mentioned and as David has underlined, this was information that the U.S. government learned about during the second week of the crisis, but the extent of the Soviet deployment of tactical nuclear weapons wouldn't become clear until the late 1990s. So keep in mind that the U.S. military was advocating an invasion of Cuba, which the president, I would argue, would never really seriously intended to do. But they were advocating this knowing that there were at least a few tactical nuclear weapons that the U.S. Marines would encounter. And they really didn't know how many, and now we know there would have been an enormous number, not just these frogs or lunas, as they were called by the Soviets, but also nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, and some of which were pointed at Guantanamo. This would have been a Holocaust.